Here at Nerl, we're known for our high-tech analysis of hardware and software, and today will be no different. I'll be reviewing the new SNES Classic controller for Switch, testing how it works on a PC, and even taking it apart to see how faithful it's remained to the original. I might even talk about the SNES Online app itself, depending on how much I want to complain today. Starting with a quick overview, the controller is obviously wireless now and has a sync button, player LEDs, Z buttons, a charging indicator, and a USB-C port. It comes with the same cable as the Switch Pro controller, and as far as I can tell, it doesn't transmit data over it. More on that later. The only other thing that stands out at a glance is that L and R aren't printed on but just slightly recessed. At this point I was going to compare it to my original, but I couldn't find it anywhere, so I'll use this N64 controller as a stand-in instead. As you can see, fewer grips, different buttons. The first thing I did after connecting it was test the D-pad. Nintendo hasn't exactly had a good run of them this generation. The Switch Pro had a terrible problem with adjacent directions triggering without being pressed. Right now I'm holding down and wiggling slightly, and as you can see it's registering left and right like mad, but not down. This is what that looks like in-game. I did the Scotch tape mod on the circuit board to improve the problem dramatically, and it's still this bad. The SNES Classic pad barely wiggles at all in comparison. I could not get it to register an adjacent direction without actually pressing that blade. It almost feels worryingly stiff, but in actual gameplay it's perfectly fine. I threw everything I could at it and I could not get it to register a bad input. Wall jumping was a piece of cake. Puyo Puyo controlled exactly as expected, and diagonal movements didn't seem to cause any trouble. I suck at fighting games, but I was at least able to pull off a few Hadoukens, and according to the input readout, the times I wasn't able to were down to me punching too early. So yes, Nintendo is still capable of making a good D-pad. The rest of the buttons feel nice and snappy aside from Start and Select, which have always been mushy and rubbery. The controller is the real deal, and there's a novelty to playing SNES games with the gamepad they were designed around. The app recognizes when the controller is connected and changes the colors and sounds, which is a neat touch. The Z buttons aren't very comfortable to press, but the app only uses them for screenshots in the home menu, which is fine. Outside of the app, Nintendo leaves you free to use the controller at your own risk. There are no warnings or restrictions when booting games up, so if you try to play a game requiring analog input, you'll find yourself unable to move. If Link's Awakening only supported the D-pad, you'd be able to fully play it. There's also no home button when playing outside of the app, so you'll need to keep another Switch controller nearby to exit games. The Collection of Mana is a really obvious match, and the controller works perfectly there. The Pixel games, Cave Story and Kero Blaster, are also really good fits. Hollow Knight is technically playable, but it requires using the Z buttons for some fairly timing-intensive actions, which isn't comfortable. So you can try it anywhere you like, but whether you'll be able to actually play is very hit or miss. When I tried connecting to a PC with the USB cable, I got no response. In comparison, the Switch Pro is quickly recognized as a gamepad and is available for use straight away. That suggests that the controller doesn't communicate over USB, unless it does so in some way that PC can't understand. Using Bluetooth, the controller connects exactly as easily as the Switch Pro does and is recognized as a D-input device. It can then be configured in emulators without any trouble. Steam games are hit and miss with D-input support. Cave Story worked without any problem, while Axiom Verge failed to recognize it. For games like this, you'll need some kind of software to convert to X input. Valve themselves could add native Steam support, since they've been pretty good with Switch controllers so far, but that might depend on whether Nintendo actually sells any more of these things. So to summarize, it works perfectly in the online app and on official emulators, but for other Switch and Steam games it really depends. Now let's see how close it really is to the original design. Nintendo uses tri-wing screws to try to keep people from doing things like this, but they didn't count on me visiting Play Asia. I'm expecting to see the Joy-Con battery inside, and there it is, HAC006. The Joy-Cons get about 20 hours of life, and that's with rumble and motion, so I expect this controller should last a fair amount longer. The Z buttons aren't buttons at all, but are spring-loaded digital switches. They're probably cheaper and less durable than buttons, so you definitely don't want to use these for gameplay. The triggers are a single piece of molded plastic, whereas the originals used metal rods to hold them in place. The new method seems more efficient, and I don't really notice a difference in the trigger feel. The trigger pads have square bases now, which I assume holds them in place better. The battery and the bracket that hold it in place are very lightweight, so it's no surprise that the controller doesn't feel heavier. A few Phillips head screws later and I can remove the player LED filter and start comparing the boards. The new one is a fair amount different, with the contacts being different shapes and sizes and all of the chips being smaller. The little shelves for the trigger buttons also appear to be wider. The button pad is very different, lacking the anchoring hooks and semicircular borders. The contacts underneath also appear to be much bigger. The start and select buttons have 2 contacts rather than 1, and they seem to also get 2 contacts on the circuit board. And now the moment of truth. The D-pad is anchored just like the original and it is really stuck on there. More on that later. The button itself looks identical on top, but the underside is surprisingly different. The original pivoted on a ball, while the new one has a cylindrical post, more like the other modern D-pads. The membrane underneath looks very faithful to the original in every way except the material, which has this cool shimmer to it. And that's basically everything of note. It's not a completely faithful replica in terms of its construction, and it's built more like a modern controller, but it functionally manages to feel the same. It's interesting to see that the D-pad is different enough from the original that you could consider it a new design, yet it works so much better than the actual new designs Nintendo has been releasing. Maybe that unchanged rubber pad is the part that really counts. In any case, it's a great controller that does exactly what it's supposed to do, but with shipping and taxes factored in, it nearly costs $40, which is a bit much unless you really want to use this heavily. I actually prefer the feel of the Switch Pro, and if it had a decent D-pad, I probably would have just stuck with that. I don't even know if reviewing the Classic is worthwhile, since it's currently sold out and it's not even clear if Nintendo is going to make any more. So take it for what it's worth, but I'd rate it 9 out of 10, only docking 1 for the price. Did you see what I did there? I put the wrong number on the screen, it's just a little joke I've been doing to see if people are paying attention. I did it on purpose. The online app seems to use the same Canoe emulator from the SNES Mini, but with a few emulation glitches fixed. It also appears to output at 1080p now, while the Classic was locked to 720p. The result is that you get a 4x scale instead of 3, and the sharpness improvement is really noticeable on my screen. Unfortunately, the lack of options once again undermines the service. There's no button mapping, which was a complaint with the NES app that has fallen on deaf ears. As an example of why mapping is important, I use a scheme for Super Metroid that uses ZL to run with the other triggers aiming up and down. The game menu locks aiming to the triggers only, so you can only do this by mapping ZL as something else, like select. So without button mapping options in the app, I have to give up an aiming direction to make the scheme work. I also don't like that the app forces the L and R bumpers as the default triggers, since ZL and ZR are the ones that the fingers naturally rest on. I'd much rather swap them around and use the bumpers for the menus instead. This isn't as big of an issue when using the SNES controller, since the faithful feel is the whole point, but even then there are things I'd like to change. For example, spin jumping with the trigger like the new Mario games allows you to do normal jumps and spin jumps without having to move your thumb. The visual options are adequate at best, and you can't change the border around the screen. The border at least isn't as distracting as the collection of mono ones were, but this shouldn't be an issue, especially since the SNES Mini gave a dozen options. The control guide can at least be turned off now, but the player icon never dims or goes away. You get the same display modes as the Mini system. Pixel Perfect combines an 8:7 ratio with integer scaling, as if Nintendo knew that the kind of asshole like me that cares about one of those things also probably wants the other. The 4:3 option not only stretches the image wider, but bumps the scaling up to 4.5x, which is noticeably blurrier. I imagine some people out there might want to do integer scaling with 4:3 as well, so why not keep the options separate? The Crt Filter is a nice gesture, but it's a difficult filter type to pull off well. There's a wide range of them on PC, with some of them looking very sharp and appealing, while others try to distort and degrade the image more. This one is completely on the degrade and blur the picture side of things, which doesn't appeal to me, but maybe some people like it. You can create up to 4 save states, and there's an extremely abusable rewind feature that allows you to reverse mistakes and cheat your way through any game. Really hardcore players will probably balk at it, but it does seem like a great aid for people who might not otherwise be able to finish more difficult games. There's also an online play feature, which is the kind of thing I want to see Nintendo doing more of. You can do this with a lot of unofficial emulators, but it's usually a little more complicated to set up. Nintendo has a lot of potential to provide things that fan emulators can't, and it's nice to see them at least taking a few steps in that direction. Overall, it's the best emulator that Nintendo has released, but it's still not very competitive with what you can get on PC, and it even takes a step back from the Wii U with the loss of button mapping. The rate of game updates is also concerning, since Nintendo has stated that they will not be releasing regular monthly updates anymore, and I don't see any way to interpret that as meaning more games will be released. But if I'm being honest, the emulation itself is fine. This is probably the first time I've ever felt comfortable enough with a Nintendo emulator to say that I'd actually be okay with playing my games there instead of on SNES. That doesn't mean I'm going to, since SNES is still better, but with a few more feature updates and more titles, it could be really solid. Nintendo is using their classic games to cover for what I think is universally agreed to be a pretty terrible online service, which isn't even really a service as much as it is a ransom fee for online play. But as far as covers go, this does the job really well and finally makes the service worth paying for.